Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Genevieve LeBaron, a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Sheffield in the UK and Human Trafficking and Modern-Day Slavery Fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at the MacMillan Center. She is the author of Protest, Inc., The Corporatization of Activism with Peter Dauvergne, as well as numerous journal articles. She also writes widely for the media and is founder and editor of the Beyond Trafficking and Slavery section of OpenDemocracy.net, which has over 9 million readers. Last year, she was awarded the British Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences Rising Star Engagement Award. Today, we'll talk with her about global labor standards and exploitation. Welcome, Professor LeBaron.
Thank you for having me.
Very nice to have you here with us today. So let's start with kind of an overview of the book project you're working on. Tell us about it.
Sure. The book project that I'm working on here in my fellowship at Yale is looking at what the big brand companies are doing about forced labor, human trafficking, and slavery in their supply chains. So that's looking at companies like Nike, Walmart, Apple, Nestle, who in the past 15 years or so have been increasingly concerned about the issues of forced labor and trafficking in their supply chains around the world. The International Labor Organization estimates about 21 million victims of forced labor in the world today, and most of that forced labor does take place in the private economy, so in the supply chains of companies like those that I mentioned. And so over the past 15 years or so, those companies have launched a whole bunch of initiatives ranging from different types of auditing to data analytics to multi-stakeholder initiatives, certifications like fair trade, just a whole spate of activity to try to address the issue of forced labor in their supply chain. And what I'm looking at in the book is the effectiveness of those types of initiatives. Are they actually working to trigger change on the ground to actually address the prevalence of forced labor within these chains? Or are they in some ways potentially driving the problem deeper into the shadows of the global economy? And so I'm looking at this question of effectiveness. I'm looking at the question of how are the private initiatives that companies are launching interacting with the public ones that states are taking to things like regulation, labor inspection? Are they complementing each other? Are the corporate initiatives supplementing and strengthening the public regulatory initiatives? Or is there a trade-off going on where the private ones are taking a sort of greater role in the governance sphere and the public ones are becoming less rigorous and potentially have less teeth? So those are the types of things I'm getting at.
Okay. And what led you to be interested in this obviously difficult topic?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some ways, it goes back quite a ways for me. When I was an undergraduate in Washington State, there was a real problem going on with prison labor. So that was in the late, early 2000s. There was a lot of companies using prison labor as a alternative to sort of outsourcing overseas. So there were reports of companies like Boeing, Starbucks, Nike, Victoria's Secret, usually through their suppliers or subsidiaries, but setting up shop in prisons and using prisoners as a labor force instead of free workers on the outside. And so I became interested at that time in the community that I was living. There was a lot of concern about this, and there was the question of, does this violate prisoners' human rights? You have people who are usually in prison in the US for poverty-related crimes, unable to find jobs in many cases, then being made to work in prison, usually with very little pay and without a real ability to refuse that work. And so I became interested in that. Less in the human rights elements of it and more in the kind of political economic role that it was playing in the US economy. What were companies getting out of this in terms of it? But mostly, what was the government getting out of it? What was the government gaining by opening up their prisons to industry? And so I just became interested in that relationship between private companies and the private economy and forms of labor that are non-standard, that we tend to think of as being more antiquated. Prison labor, of course, goes very, very far back in the history of U.S. capitalism and emerged in the sort of aftermath of slavery, and it was an exception to the abolition of slavery. So it's a form of involuntary servitude. So my interest really goes back to that point of these things that we tend to think of as antiquated relations. Why do they emerge? Why are they so resilient in the global economy? And why haven't the forces of modernity and the kind of modern corporation eradicated these forms of forced labor? And why did some companies seem to make use of them as an alternative to a public labor force?
Okay. I think many people would be somewhat surprised to know that modern day slavery is happening as a part of corporate America. So I'm imagining that this is going on in countries where corporations do business when they farm out work overseas. So let's talk specifics. Give us a couple of examples of things that you know about that are currently going on.
Sure, yeah. I mean, forced labor takes a number of different forms. It has been documented in almost every country in the world. So it's not exclusively a problem that's confined to the global south, though as you're saying, a lot of it does take place in the global south. Just to give a few examples of what this kind of looks like, The Guardian, it's a UK-based newspaper, recently did a 6-month undercover investigation of the shrimp industry in Thailand, which was a real shock, I think, to a lot of Americans, because that investigation uncovered that forced labor, human trafficking, slavery were rampant in an industry that supplies to the big retailers, in the US, in the UK, in Europe, like Costco and Tesco. And what was happening there was that people were being recruited, usually migrant workers from neighboring countries like Burma, into the Thai fishing industry, and the workers were paying the recruiters, these third-party agents, a fee to find them a job in the Thai shrimp industry. And so they were paying this fee, and then they were essentially being sold off to boat captains, where they were at sea. They were in, kind of hidden parts of the economy. They're at sea. There's not a lot of surveillance. No one's really checking, and there were rampant abuses that ranged from torture to manipulation of debt and wages. All sorts of practices that were classified as slavery. So that's one way that this can manifest. Another type of example in a more manufacturing industry would be Apple has recently taken a really important step in banning what they called involuntary servitude in their supply chain. So what they discovered over the past year or so was that in some of their supplier factories like Foxconn, Pegatron in China, a similar dynamic was happening with recruiters going to find workers who really needed work, workers who were pretty vulnerable, often migrants, who didn't have any real opportunity to work where they were living. And so then they'd pay the workers would pay a fee to the recruiter. They'd end up in the supplier factory already very much in debt. So the fee might be a month's wages. And then that debt was used to impose very difficult working conditions, sometimes involuntary overtime, a lot of the dynamics we associate with forced labor. And so what Apple did, to their credit, I think, is that they said, workers can't be made to pay those fees. Actually, the supplier firm needs to pay those fees to the recruiter, and even though ultimately that meant Apple itself will be, having to cost that into their business model, they were willing to do that. So they've refunded $4 million recently to workers. But a lot of companies, that's a practice that happens pretty endemically within a lot of industries, and very few companies have taken that kind of leading role that Apple's taken to address it in the way that they have.
Okay. In working on the book, how are you doing the research for it? I would imagine in a variety of ways. Are you talking to actual people in companies? where things like this happen? What are you doing?
That's a great question. Forced labor, as you can well imagine, is an extremely difficult topic to research. It's illegal in almost every country in the world. And for good reasons, you know, companies and governments are very hesitant to give researchers access to their workers and supply chains. So one of the things I've been working on over the past couple of years is an initiative with the British Academy looking at methods for forced labor research. So that's been bringing together a number of us who are working on social scientific research on forced labor to talk about how we can strengthen the methods. At the moment, there's no country-level data on forced labor that's reliable. There's some very good case studies of forced labor by sector, so that have looked at forced labor in the electronics industry or in the garment industry or in a particular country. And what I've done in my book is use that sector-level data as a sort of starting point to understanding the dynamics and the patterns of how some of this is actually playing out. But what I've done in my book is I have about 3 different strategies of research that I've been carrying out over the past few years. So one is that I've looked at sector level data on forced labor. I've done some studies of forced labor in the UK, in the cannabis, food, and construction industries. And that's given me a really good sense of the patterns of how these practices manifest, but also some of what companies are doing to address them. I've also taken a look at audit firm data. So that's the data that audit firms are collecting. They're the ones who are kind of going in and being the boots on the ground in terms of conducting these inspections of factories, mining sites, the like. And so they have a lot of knowledge of how these practices have evolved over time, whether we're seeing increases or decreases in different sectors, et cetera. So I've used some of that to gain insights about whether, you know, how practices are evolving. And the last thing that I've done is I've interviewed a lot of people with firsthand knowledge of the corporate social responsibility initiatives and their effectiveness. So that ranges from industry representatives to auditors to people involved with multi-stakeholder initiatives, really just a range of different people. I've conducted about 100 interviews on these questions to try to get the best knowledge that's available about whether these initiatives are effective, under what circumstances they're effective, and what the gaps are in terms of further work that needs to be done.
Okay, so what are the gaps in terms of laws that are on the books at this point? I mean, how are these people falling through the cracks, so to speak?
I mean, that's a very good question. I think what we're seeing, you mentioned law on the books. I think one of the things we're seeing is that there's actually very good laws on the books of a lot of countries. And that the problem is coming, one of the main problems is coming in terms of enforcement of those laws. So in a lot of countries, labor inspectorates have been cut. The budget for labor inspection has been reduced. And so you have real challenges in terms of governments actually monitoring and enforcing their own laws. And in the wake of that, the private sector has really taken on a greater role. But what we're seeing is that some of those initiatives like auditing don't necessarily work as well as the public sector initiatives to inspect factories. And so there are a number of challenges that come up in relation to the private sector having really taken on board the issue of forced labor, trafficking, and slavery, but not necessarily pursuing the types of initiatives and policies that seem to address the root causes of these problems on the ground.
So what do you suggest to help fix the problem? What do you think would work?
I think that's a very big question.
Yes, I know, and I know I'm putting you on the spot, but you know, what are your ideas?
Yeah, I think that what we need to start looking at is we need to start looking closely at the root causes of the problems within business models. So there's been a real attention to the symptoms of the problems of forced labor, addressing you know, the worst exploitations and really, you know, trying to break those people out of slavery type situations, and that's been really important work that NGOs and others have conducted. But what we need to start looking much more closely at are the root causes of why these types of exploitation are thriving in the first place. And that gets into questions around things like subcontracting, the relationship between the big brands and the suppliers in their supply chain. It gets at questions around the price of goods. You know, there's been a lot of pressure going on to produce goods more and more cheaply and sell them more and more cheaply. And that can create some real risks around labor standards, because it's very difficult to produce goods quickly, cheaply, on time, deliver them to the retailer, and do it in a way that honors good labor practice.
Right.
So you've seen, on the one hand, a rising demand for sub-minimum wage labor, which can sometimes take the form of forced labor in supply chains, and on the other hand, a burgeoning supply of people who don't have decent work, who are entering into very vulnerable, risky types of jobs. So you need to be able to combat both of those sides of the root causes, the supply and the demand issues around forced labor in supply chains.
Okay, ultimately, you know, what are you hoping people will take away from your book?
That's another good question. I guess I'm hoping that people will take away the idea that these are systemic issues. There's been a lot of attention on, you know, different sectors. So the effectiveness, say, of fair trade on coffee growers in Guatemala, or these types of, you know, can we really look at effectiveness on this micro scale and combat these issues on a micro scale? And part of what I think I'm trying to get at in the book and trying to understand in the book is whether that's effective, or whether we need to be taking a much more systemic look at these problems as problems that are fundamentally rooted in how the global economy itself is set up and organized and run and governed. And so I think that reframing forced labor and trafficking and slavery as global economic problems that are really deeply rooted in the broader structures of the global economy, things like inequality, things like the power of companies via governments, et cetera, is what I'm really hoping to understand and to raise questions about in the book.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you for having me.
For more information about Professor LeBaron and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.